If you remember, if you were with us last week, we're looking at, I guess let's just start with what we're doing this week. We're at week 11. I can't believe we're one away from completing the book of James. We're going to be studying verses 7 through 12 of chapter 5, looking at the topic of patience and suffering, and look at what James has to say about both of those things. So some of this will be a little bit of a rehash of what he talked about earlier in James, but I think this is certainly a really good study, something for us to be able to learn and to hear, especially in our day and age. Again, I mean, we've talked about James and how practical his words have been for the Christians, the Jewish Christians he was writing to 2,000 years ago, but certainly equally applicable for us in today's time, especially with what we're going through in 2020. So we're going to be looking at patience and suffering. But before we go on, I want to look at review what we looked at last week. We looked at the first 6 verses of James chapter 5, and really the key idea that James was looking at last week is really the danger of riches. And we talked about, I know we've said this before, money is certainly not the evil, but the love of money can be the root of all evil. And we really discussed how, especially in our day and time, with the blessings that we have and the riches that we have here in the States, of how dangerous riches can be for us. That, comparatively to the Jewish Christians that he was writing to, we are considered extremely rich, even in comparison to who he was writing to. But with great riches becomes great responsibility and great temptation. And so I think it was really certainly an eye-opening passage for me, and hopefully it was for you all, as we considered the riches that we have, the things that God has given us stewardship over, and how we're using that. How we're using that for ourselves, how we're using that for others, how we're using that for the kingdom, because everything that we have can be used for the kingdom. And if kind of following this theme of what James has said is, if God has transformed your life, that transforms everything about it, including the way we use our money and use our wealth and use our excess. And so we talked about that last week. And so as we transition to again what we're looking at in verses 7 through 12, we're going to see a similar theme what we saw in James chapter 1. So if someone could be so kind as to read James chapter 5 verses 7 through 12 to kind of set the stage, set the tone for what we're going to be talking about tonight. Not everybody at once.
Okay, I'll read, Daniel.
Okay, thanks.
Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. But above all, my brothers, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation.
Thanks, Brother Chuck. I want you, as we kind of introducing this section, I want you to think back to the first time you were introduced to the concept of patience. It's kind of like a weird question to ask. Like it's like almost like when were you introduced to the concept of love? But can you think of a specific time in your life when you remember vividly the time that you were either taught patience or realized patience was a thing? Anyone remember that?
When my mother said I didn't have any. I remember that vividly.
It's it's a patience is a tough thing to learn, especially at a young age. I remember the first time that I remember actually understanding the concept of what it was. I was probably 8 or 9. Every summer, what would happen is I would always go to my grandparents' house and spend a week or two there. And so this particular summer, they actually came and picked me up from my parents' house. They lived a couple hours away. We lived in Conway. They lived in Jonesboro. And of course, anytime you ride with grandma and grandpa, they always will stop at the store to let you pick out whatever candy that you want. I mean, any good grandparent does that, right? So at this particular time, they stopped at a gas station like normal. I said, go ahead, choose whichever candy bar that you want, and we'll go with it. For whatever reason, I don't know why I wanted to try this, but have you ever heard of a sugar daddy? You don't know what that candy is? That big, it's basically just that, I don't know if it's the packaging or what that drew my attention, but it's just basically a big old block of hard caramel. Why that appealed to me that particular day, I'm not exactly sure, but I thought I was going to down that thing in 2 seconds. But it's basically hard caramel on a stick, and what I thought would take a few minutes for me to consume ended up taking me nearly an hour to eat. And this is just a regular sized sugar daddy. Like I guess I don't know if it sat in the store for a long time. Maybe it's not a popular candy, but if you sunk your teeth in one of those things, like it's hard to get your teeth out. And you just I remember taking it and just trying to pull it apart. I mean, it literally took me about an hour to eat. And I remember after I ate it finally. I turned to my grandmother. I said, I told her, I said, I think I finally understand what patience is. And I feel like for whatever reason that sticks in my mind as the day that I felt like I understood what patience meant and what patience did. The lessons you learn from a sugar daddy. Let me back that. The lessons you learn from a candy bar. So what you learn at a young age, and I think we understand the concept of patience. We understand the old saying. I put this in the notes. Is patience is a virtue, and I think that certainly is true. It seems like as we go on in life, patience seems to be less and less with our society. We live in a very fast-paced society. Everyone wants what they want. They want it now. I mean, just the way that our even away from our finances are set up. How many times you walked into a store or you go to a car dealership and you say, hey, you want this? You can get it now. You don't even have to have money to buy it outright. Or we'll give you a credit card and you can pay monthly payments, but you can take it home now. And we live in that kind of fast-paced society. And while patience may be this virtue, it's not something that a lot of people possess. But it's comforting to me as I read through this, is it sounds like the Christians that James is writing to really struggled with this idea of patience. And I think at times we all struggle with this concept of patience. And so you see, as James is, after talking to the rich and greedy, what he does is shifts his focus a little bit to maybe those who are suffering. And so he returns to this key theme that he started in chapter 1, patience during suffering. And so we start to see him kind of end somewhat as where he started. As he transitions and as he starts this section in verse 7, it says, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord." And what he does is he uses this illustration for a farmer. But one of the things that stands out to me as I look at this concept, be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord, is this idea that this anticipation that these Christians must have had. And I can see obviously why they would have it, but this anticipation of Jesus coming or the coming of the Lord. And he's telling them to be patient, which, causes me to ask this question. I mean, just right off the bat, would I characterize my anticipation of the Lord coming as someone needing to tell me to be patient about it? Or, am I anticipating it? Am I excited about it? Am I looking forward to that return to the point where someone had to say, it's okay, Daniel, be patient. It's coming. It's going to happen. Do I look forward to that? And obviously, I know the times in what James is writing is quite a bit different. The Jews that are scattered abroad, they're being persecuted. So certainly the times are different, but they have this anticipation of the Lord to come back and make these sufferings right. But it makes me ask the question, am I anticipating it in a similar way? to do that. We see him doing, or James illustrating this point as he says, see how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until he receives the early and the late rains. Has anyone ever farmed, had family that's farmed, grandparents that's farmed, anything like that? Ever planted? Okay, good. We got a couple. Got a couple. So for those of you who are more experienced than I am, tell me a little bit about farming, because I don't know a thing about farming. So tell me, how does patience come into the idea of a farmer and planting and being patient about it?
Well, you can't control the rains. You can't control the weather. You plant what you want to grow, and you pray that the weather and the rains will cooperate with you, that you don't get too much rain, you don't get too little rain, and that you will be blessed with a adequate crop. Some years you'll have a bumper crop, some years you won't have anything. And personally, I wouldn't have that much patience. Most of us have jobs that we have at least a little bit of control over, but not farming.
How, for those of you who have farmed, like I said, I don't have personal experience farming. My grandparents did growing up, but how long does it typically take from the time that how long does it take to do the process, from the time that you're tilling the ground, to planting the seed, to the time that you have the idea that, hey, I'm going to farm, I'm going to grow corn, I'm going to grow strawberries, I'm going to grow whatever. From the time that you have that idea in your head to the time that you have the product in your hands, how long does that typically take?
3 months.
3 months. Wow.
If you were raising wheat, you planted in September in the Panhandle of Texas, and you didn't harvest till June.
Wow.
So you farmed all summer. You got the land ready, and for the latter rains to come. So.
Like I said, I've never actually farmed. My grandparents did growing up. They kept a small farm in their 80s, and they did. I mean, they would spend, countless hours tilling the ground, planting the seeds, watering it. Somehow, they would always make it look so much fun that the grandkids would want to help. I don't know how they did it, but they're magical about that. But we would always want to help with the yard work or things like that, because they made it look so much fun. This past summer, we were, my son Grayson kind of was taught this idea of patience. We're trying to grow a tomato plant in a container, and so he was super excited about it. We planted the seed, we set it, we watered it. He comes back inside. Not even 5-10 minutes later, what's he doing? He's running back outside to check to see if that plant has grown. And he gave us several updates, that night. Hey, Dad, just want to let you know that the plant hasn't grown yet. Did we do it right? The plant hasn't grown yet. Next day, same thing. Hey, Dad, just want to let you know the plant hasn't grown yet. I don't see anything. But it was fun to see his excitement once, after, a few weeks or a few days, to actually see that growth and see that, to see that occurring. But what's interesting to me about this illustration is, about the farmer is not only does the farmer have to be patient in doing it for the fruit, but notice the work that he has to put into it. It's not just something that he's just sitting there waiting for. He's having to put in a lot of work. He's having to till the ground. He's having to plow the fields. He's having to plant the seed. He's having to water it, keep the critters out. So there was a lot of work that had to go into it that did not have a yield specific, or did not have an immediate effect or immediate impact or immediate yield. How do you think that illustration paralleled to what the Christians, or the Jewish Christians that James is talking to about this time? This whole concept of farmer, not just the patience of it, but the work that had to go into it.
Why do you have to work so hard to plant a crop? What was the cause of it? Original sin, wasn't it? God said, cursed is the ground because of you. How are you going to eat? Can't eat that tree anymore. Ground's going to produce thorns and thistles and weeds, and by the sweat of your brow, you shall eat bread. So
Work for it.
it's all Adam and Eve's fault. But yes, it's very hard work, especially when you get older. Ask Chuck. Gardening is very hard work. Farming is really, really hard work. I worked on a farm one summer, and I like to die. I like to burn up. But it's because of sin.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the sin that caused. I didn't think about it from that standpoint, but you're right. It was the sin that caused the ground to produce, some thorns and thistles, that we had to actually work for it.
It also says until you return to the ground, that's going to be done, so that your body returns to the dust. So it kind of ties into eternity as well. We provide physically for ourselves until spiritual body is born, and of course we have to be patient until that happens. All the difficulties of life.
I think you can, and I certainly think that's right on point. I think you can also see that for, taking it from the perspective of who he's writing to, the amount of work and the amount of suffering that they're having to do, and they're not seeing an immediate result. I think it's easy to look and see when you're being persecuted, and you're being persecuted for a just cause, God saying, yes, I'm coming. I'm going to make this right. I'm going to make this right. And almost having this idea of, I want that justice. I want you to make this right now, God. I want this justice to happen now. I'm putting in the work. I'm putting in the hours. I'm suffering for the cause. I'm dispersed. These things are happening to me. Why can't this justice happen now? And I think just like the farmer, as he points out, is the farmer does all of these hard things for months, and tills and waters and plants, and you see all this hard work, yet the yield doesn't happen for several months, or so in some cases almost a year, depending on what's done. And they don't see immediate result from the toil that they see, but they do see at some point a result. And I think James is trying to remind them of this, is that yes, God's coming, the Lord's coming. He's going to set things right. He's going to enact justice. He's going to set things right for your persecution, but still labor, still toil, still continue and press on, because that will happen, and that will occur. And he repeats it. He says, be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. And then you see in verse 8, you also be patient. He repeats it twice. I've always been taught that anytime that you see something mentioned twice in a short period of time, we need to pay attention. There's an idea there that he's trying to provide to the people who he's writing to. And this idea of patience and repeating it twice is something that needs to stand out to us. And he also repeats about the coming of the Lord twice too. He says, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. What does it mean, do you think, to establish your heart?
Well, patience is part of it. Keep your heart pure and good. Don't grow weary while doing good, because in due season you'll reap if you do not quit or do not faint. Paul told the Galatians. I'm wondering if he's continuing his thought from the first 6 verses that we studied last week. If you think about it, how it ties in, these he's telling to be patient. Is he talking to those who have been defrauded by their masters? He talks about those, the rich defrauding the laborers who mowed their fields. And he concludes by saying that they have murdered the righteous, and that he does not resist you. And then right after that, he says, be patient, therefore, brothers. Is you think he's continuing his thought, or in the context, could we say that?
Well, the word therefore indicates that, right, Danny?
Yeah, therefore, I think, and that's my point. In other words, the kind of heart a brother or a Christian should have, even if someone has defrauded you, be patient. Be patient with them, because there's a judgment coming.
Yeah, I think he's carrying on the same thought. I think he's talking to different people, because in the first 6 verses, I think he's addressing the rich who may have defrauded folks. But I think now he's transitioning to those who may, like you said, who may have been defrauded or suffering, or for whatever the reason, and encouraging them despite the things that may happen from the rich can harm them. So yeah, I do think both are true. When I think of this concept of of establishing, I almost think of like a foundation, like really laying a root, like settling down, settling a root, settling a foundation for the heart for the coming of the Lord. And I think whenever you establish something, or whenever you set a foundation for something, there's this idea of preparation. This is idea of preparation, not only for the day of the Lord. Not only should we be patient for it and be anxious for it, but we also need to be prepared for it and ready for it. It reminds me of the wedding feast, or the 10 virgins who who were waiting for the bridegroom, and they didn't have enough oil. They weren't prepared for the coming of the bridegroom. I think this is I see some similarities there, where he's saying, establish your hearts, be prepared, because the Lord, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. One other question I might want to ask, when I think of this word, for the coming of the Lord is at hand, that carries this connotation of it's in the works. How do you think, and maybe what do you think James is talking about when it comes to this idea for the coming of the Lord is at hand, meaning that's in process? Do you think that's the case? Do you think that he's alluding to something that's going to be outside of these Jews' lifetimes in the future? What do you think he's getting at when he says, for the coming of the Lord is at hand?
He could to them be talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. If at hand means soon, and it generally does, it probably has reference to that.
It's one of the things I had read and thought about too, is if this was written around 48, 46 AD, and the destruction of Jerusalem was in 70 AD, that may be exactly what he's referring to, is the destruction of Jerusalem, because the people who are persecuting them at this point are not the Romans, it's the Jews, right? The Jews are the ones who are persecuting these Jewish Christians, not necessarily yet the Romans. Now that will come later. But perhaps he's alluding to, like you said, the destruction of Jerusalem when that occurs.
I don't know. I think he's just saying that you don't know when the Lord's coming back. You need to be prepared at any time. Yeah,
it could be too. Absolutely. And like I said, this. As I read through, especially these first 2 verses, it really caused me to think about how my view of the returning of the Lord is. Like, how often do I think about it? Do I anticipate it? When I do think about it, what feelings does that invoke? Am I excited about it? Am I anxious about it? Am I afraid or scared or happy? Like, what emotions do I feel whenever I think about that? How do I think about my preparations for that? And would I be characterized as saying, man, I need to be patient with this because of those reactions? And it caused me to think about some of those things as well. As he continues on, this kind of is a natural progression. It says, do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. It says, behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. When you think about suffering, people who suffer, and I think you can see this, like 2020 is a picture perfect year of this. What is our tendency, what tendency do you see in people when they begin to suffer? What do they typically like to do? Like when you have a bunch of people who are sharing experiences or are suffering together, what do they typically like to do?
Gripe and complain.
Yep, gripe and complain. How many people have you heard gripe and complain about 2020? I mean, I've been one of those, so I'm raising my hand because I've been a guilty offender. of that. But typically when people go through something together, one of the tendencies that we have is to gripe and complain about it. And what's interesting here is, James says, don't grumble against one another. Again, it's specifically against one another, but what does it mean to grumble? Is grumble and complaining the same thing, or does grumble carry something else?
To me, grumble just means constant.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not going to do any good.
Mm-hmm.
But for some strange reason, it makes you feel better to gripe about it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, you just don't move on. It's constant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What other things do you think of when you guys think of grumbling? So we have this constant, this consistency, constantness of grumble or of complaining. What whenever you hear that word, what are some other ideas of the word grumble?
Israel, and they had to wander around for 40 years because they were grumbling and sinning,
mm-hmm.
and died.
Oh, that reminds me of another murmur. Murmur is the other word I was looking for. Grumbling and murmuring.
I also think about when I think about grumbling, I think about kind of under your breath. He's not it's when I think of grumbling against one another, I don't think about two people airing out their grievances against one another in a public place. It's just this kind of backbiting, kind of under the skin, just kind of talking behind people's backs, under your breath, like just constant frustration and nagging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good picture of that too, Jake. I was curious. I looked up how the dictionary defines it, at least how dictionary.com defined it, and it said that grumbling is complaining, but in a bad-tempered way. And I think that circles around in everything that we're doing, whether it's under our breath or consistent doing. It's complaining in a way that is very, very bad-tempered in a consistent way. Like I said, mumbling or grumbling under your breath. Have you ever been around? And you may have done this before, and I think I've done this too. So if you're in good company, I don't know if it's good company. You're in company. Have you ever gotten to a point where, like, if you're like, you almost have like a grumbling match with somebody where like you're undergoing a suffering or something like that, and then like you guys compare your suffering, like, oh, you're suffering, but my suffering's better than yours or worse than yours, or you have nothing to complain about because look at this, look at what I'm going through. Have y'all ever done that or had that tendency or seen people do that?
Never.
So I just want to let you know, like, you can raise your hand and no one's going to see it on YouTube. So like, you can't see yourself. The only thing it's seen on is the screen I'm sharing. So you can raise your hand and do this discreetly, and no one on YouTube will know.
I thought that's what Facebook was created for.
Who can one up it's almost like keeping up with the Joneses, except for pain, suffering, and complaining. I just wonder, why do you think we have that tendency when we grumble? Why do we feel like we have this idea of comparing sufferings?
Misery loves company.
Yeah, absolutely.
Misery loves company.
Yeah, Daniel, the King James Version says well, hang on just a second here. Well, I've lost my spot here now. Anyway, it means in the Greek, at least, it meant to sigh or to murmur, and also one definition was to pray inaudibly with grief or groan or grudge. And I would also relate that to eye rolling. You don't even have to say a word. You can give an impression of distaste with someone just by rolling your eyes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I pulled up the King James Version. It said, "Grudge not against one another."
Yes, that's what it says. Yeah.
Yeah, this is not talking about general grumbling, although that's probably not good to do.
Sure.
But talking about grumbling against brethren, and I think it's important. In fact, it's condemning grumbling against some of our brethren.
Yeah, and that's a great point. You know, I think this is one of Satan's most powerful weapons. You know, getting people to getting Christians to turn on one another, or getting Christians to grumble against one another. It's a really powerful tool that he has, because it's something that can slip in really easily. And a lot of times we can feel justified in our grumbles or our complaints. Maybe it's a grudge against somebody else or something like that. A lot of times when we do these things or engage in these things, we almost feel justified in doing that. And I think what James is, certainly reminding us is that, grumbling is not good in any case, but certainly do not grumble against your brethren, because we're on the same team here, especially if we're going through these things together. We don't need the last thing we need to do is grumble against one another, because, it's kind of the same concept as, we're all on the same team here. And he reminds us that, do that so you may not be judged, because the judge is standing at the door, which I think goes back to reminding us of what James said something earlier about even the things that we grumble. Like our words carry weight. Behold the power of words. Our words carry weight, and we're going to be held accountable for the words that we speak, even the things that we grumble. And I think James is trying to point us to that, hey, the judge is at the door. Like he's not just in a faraway place. He said, don't do this so you may not judge, because the judge is here. Watch what you say. Even amongst what you grumble, even what you complain about, even what you complain against one another about, watch what you say and watch your words, because the judge is standing at the door listening, and you will be held accountable for the things that you say, especially against your brethren. And, as he finishes this particular, these two verses in verse 10, he says, as an example. So I love, James does a great job of this. He always provides us an example. He says, as an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. I would have to agree with him on this. I don't know of a better example of suffering and of patience than those of old and the prophets. You think of Ezekiel, you think of Isaiah, you think of Hosea, you think of the things that they had to endure. You think of Elijah, you think of Elisha. We have things, we have prophets who, were persecuted to the point where they were, kings were going after them, were trying to kill them and eradicate them. They were made fun of. You remember the Elisha who got made fun of by those 40 kids, called them Baldy. Didn't really work out well for the kids. They all got mauled by a bear. But they didn't live glamorous lives by any means. I think of the Hebrew writer and what he said about God's people, because I think the prophets fall into this. So listen to what he says here. I don't think I have this on the screen, but the Hebrew writer points out, it says, some were tortured, some were mocked, some were flogged, imprisoned, stoned. Listen to this one, sawn in two, killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins, goat skins, destitute, afflicted, mistreated. They wandered about in deserts and caves. And he said, these people suffered and attained a greater reward than they could have ever imagined. But you just think about what it would take for the patience that someone has to have to endure that kind of pain and suffering. You think about the apostles and the deaths that how they died, and the patience that they had, knowing that it was going to yield a greater reward, but they suffered through that. And there was this idea, this play of suffering and patience, and he points to them. Somebody got sawn in two like that. You see these graphic details of what happened to the prophets of old and the people of old. And you see their patience and their suffering in that. And he's pointing to them as saying, look at these people as an example of what they endured and the reward that they now have, to look past these things. And so, that's, I think it's something that, they would take encouragement from. And I think it's something that we can look at too, to see that we're not in this by ourselves. We have a road that's been paved of people who have done this. And you can think about what they're like, where they are now, and the joy and the inexpressible joy that they're experiencing right now, because of what they did. But before you think that he's done, as we move into verse 11, he says, "Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast." We've heard that word before, right? We've heard him say the word steadfast from earlier in James. He says, "You've heard the steadfastness of Job." Just as a reminder, what does it mean to be steadfast?
It means immovable.
Unwavering.
Mm-hmm. Immovable, unwavering. Yep.
Patience during trials.
Mm-hmm.
Keeping on, keeping on.
Mm-hmm. It's a characteristic I'd love to have behind my name. If James was writing about me, I'd like steadfast would be a characteristic I'd love to have described of me. But he points. Who does he point to? What is the example that James points to?
Job.
Job. How was Job steadfast?
He wouldn't deny the Lord, even though life and his friends all told him he should.
Mm-hmm. Everything got taken away from him. Physically, everything got taken away. His health, his family, his possessions. I mean, and just in this, just one after another, everything physically was taken away from him, minus his life. And you see Job not sinning in the words that he did. I think you probably argue he got pretty close as you go throughout Job. But you see a steadfast. I think one of the things that we have the benefit of seeing in Job is we see the big picture. Like we see what was happening behind the scenes. Job never got that. Like I don't think anywhere in the book of Job was Job explained that of how everything came about. Like how this was a challenge that Satan made of God, and God said, "Okay, do it." Which Job never knew that. And even to the end, Job never knew that. And which I think is even more incredible is Job never received an answer or an explanation or the circumstance behind his suffering, yet he still remained steadfast. That despite not seeing an end in sight, despite not knowing the answers, despite not knowing why this was happening to him, he still stayed steadfast. And I think that's something that we should see there. But notice how he continues. He said, "You have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful." What do you think he means by "you have seen the purpose of the Lord" in the story of Job? What do you think the purpose of the Lord was in the story of Job?
God is in control even when it seems like all is lost. God is still God, and Job never forgot who God was.
Mm-hmm.
And God explained who he was. And of course, he received it all back. Remain faithful, remain steadfast, and God will take care of you.
Mm-hmm.
We had Zach Hardesty did a lesson on Job about a year ago, and one of the things that he said that I kind of stuck with me was, God in the end reminded Job, the no one really worries about the eagle or like the animals, like having God knows everything that goes on with every single one of them, and what he was reminding Job was, how God is everything. You're so infant. I'm like, you can't even come close to even understanding the mightiness of his being. And so it was more of a thing of, I don't know if it's the purpose of God, but maybe it was in a thing of, as much as you think that you might, as Job thought that he knew of the Lord, he didn't even come close to understanding even a fraction of what, but even going through the trials that he had gone through, still he had a better understanding. But I think that God still said, even through all of that, you still don't understand. There's just no way for you to understand how everything that I know is so much more than anything you'll ever even halfway, like you can't even conceive of stuff that I don't know or stuff that I don't even really care about, because it's your understanding and my understanding are two totally different things.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think Job gets to see a glimpse of something that I don't think he was ready for. I think he realizes it, but God, I think, clearly points out where Job is on the map of things, as he's pointing out all these different things that he can. That's a good point.
Satan can't win. Satan cannot win if we're patient and remain faithful, can he?
Mm-hmm.
And again, in the context here, he's telling these brethren to be patient, but what are they going through? They're suffering. Be patient in your suffering. How did James begin the book? Count it all joy when you fall into various trials. So the opposite of that would be complaining and murmuring and grumbling, wouldn't it?
Yeah. One, and I don't know if this is in the Greek or not, but one definition of patience is long suffering. What does it mean to long suffer? I think he probably bound up in the word itself. It means to suffer for a long time. And I think that's part of especially I think that fits perfectly to what James is talking about here to the people who he's talking to, that they are having to suffer for a long time. I think it's a perfect picture of what the prophets have been doing. They've suffered for a long time. I think we think of patience from the standpoint of just waiting, but in this context, it carries this idea of, yes, you're waiting, but you're also suffering while you wait. And that's a different story. That's a different kind of patience, and that's a different kind of attribute that we need to have. Not just being patient when, like I said, I don't think he's talking about being patient while you're sitting in the drive-through and someone's taking a long time. Like this is true suffering here. True patience is suffering for an extended period of time or a long time, and even if you don't have an end in sight. And I think that's where you see with steadfastness of Job, is he was steadfast, not even seeing an end in sight, but still remained true to God and still remained true to him. When you look at how he ends it, he says, how the Lord, you've heard the steadfastness of Job, you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. I have to admit, when I look at the story of Job, the last two words I probably think of are compassion and mercy. When it comes to the story of Job, that's not usually the words that come to our mind when we think of the story of Job. We think of patience, we think of suffering, we think of steadfastness. Compassion and mercy aren't the ones that we typically think. But how do you see, or where do you see maybe God's compassion and mercy in the story of Job?
That he prevented Satan from taking Job's life. That he said, you can do all this to him, but that you can't take his life. And that kind of this too shall pass. That can't go on forever.
Absolutely. We see limitations placed on Satan's ability to do things to him. He had limits at first to not touch him, and then we see limits placed on him not to take his life. And so we see mercy in God's mercy in extending those limits or providing those limits to Job. Where do you think you'd see compassion in that story?
He restored everything to him at the end. He gave him more. And plus, if we look at it from an eternal standpoint, he didn't lose. If those children were faithful that lost their lives, he didn't lose them. He gained even more.
Absolutely. And I know that typically when we look at the story of Job, those things don't typically pop off the page to us when we do a study. But I mean, we are reminded of God's compassion and God's mercy. And I think that's really interesting that James points that out. Not only does he talk about, not only do we learn about Job's steadfastness, but again, we learn something about God in that story, about his compassion and his mercy. And I think anytime that we look at a story, we can not only see what we can learn from the character or the person who is impacted by that, but also what we can learn from God. That's something that we need to pay attention to when we can learn both of those things. So as we conclude with verse 12, let me just, before we actually read verse 12, as you're going through this, what do you think would be a logical way to end this section? After he's talking about patience and suffering, and he's talked about prophets, he's talked about Job, where do you think it's going to end? What do you think would be how would you conclude this this section?
I wouldn't think of verse 12.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It kind of just it kind of stands out just as because especially with how he phrases it. He says above all. Like, I mean, he goes through patience, he goes through suffering, he goes through Job, and then he says, but above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under temptation. I mean, he's essentially quoting Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus said essentially the same thing. But where do you think this ties in? This to me, when I first read through it, it just seems completely out of place, completely random. But it seems to divide verses 7 through 11 from verses 13 to the end of the chapter. It just seems to be out of place. But where do you think this fits in? Is it out of place? How does it fit?
Well, again, I go back to the context of the first 7 verses. You see these 2 brothers standing in the field the day after they got paid, and they were defrauded, and they can murmur, complain, and grumble. Or they can be dependable, honest, hardworking, consistent, and do what they need to be doing to please the Lord. So I think in that way, I think it fits in perfectly. Be dependable no matter what's going on in your life, no matter how you're suffering. Be dependable, be consistent, be honest, work hard, obey the Lord.
It's like almost an integrity issue. Saying what you're going to say and doing what you're going to do, or saying what you're going to, or doing what you say. So let me ask you this: what's the big deal? Like, what's the big deal of swearing by heaven or by earth or by other oath? Like, what is the big deal? And is there any significance to swearing, taking oaths for the people he's writing to? Remember, these are Jewish Christians. Is there any significance to that?
Based on their tradition, you could swear, but then if you swore by the gold of the temple, apparently that means I really mean what I'm telling you. And he's saying, if you're treating each other the way you're supposed to be treating each other, you shouldn't have to question each other's word at any time, period.
You shouldn't have to swear on your mama's grave or your grandmother's grave to mean what you say, or the gold in the temple. It's an integrity issue. You shouldn't have to swear by something in order for people to take you seriously, that the next thing that comes out of your mouth is going to be something that you need, that you're actually going to do. There's this, kind of, Chris, what you're saying, there was apparently this idea that, if I swear by the gold of the temple, or if I do these, one of these 2 things, that if I don't do that, then I'm scotch free. Like if I swear to you that I'm going to do something, then that's all well and good. But if I don't do it, it's okay because I didn't swear by the gold of the temple. So I found a loophole there. We see the Pharisees kind of doing this idea, but I think that idea permeates this Jewish thought, because again, the Pharisees were the religious leaders. The teaching would largely come from the Pharisees, and so I think this idea probably permeates. Is if I swear by this, or if I swear by that, then that's going to hold me more accountable to those things. But again, James is pointing to power of our words. Don't swear by anything. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. As God's people, we shouldn't have to validate our words by swearing by something. Don't swear by what God has made, because God listens. Again, this accountability of our words. Every idle word that we speak is going to be held under account. even our yeses and nos are heard by God. And I like what Brent Kercheval said about this when he was talking about Jesus's words in Matthew 34-37. He says, our truthfulness should be so consistent and dependable that we don't need an oath to support it. We don't need an oath to validate the things that we say. And so that's something that we as Christians, as God's people, need to remember that we are a people who say what we're going to do, and if we're not going to do what we say, then we don't need to say it, because we're not going to fall in these into these criteria. So it's something that we need to remember. When you look at this, as kind of we're wrapping up, there's a lot of things that are written about suffering. There's sermons, there's songs, a lot of even entertainment, movies and things like that about circumstances where people suffer. But there doesn't seem to be an easy answer to the question of suffering, because it often just seems unfair. And James doesn't really get into that. He doesn't get into the unfairness of it. He doesn't get into why suffering is allowed. But what he does seem to do is acknowledge what's going to happen and says, here's what we can do with the suffering. We can be patient with the suffering. We can not grumble while we suffer. We can make sure that it doesn't divide us as we grumble against one another. We can trust that being patient and persevering and riding it through till the end is going to result in our being blessed, is going to result in something better for us. And the way that he can support that, he doesn't just say this and just say, here you go. He supports this by the examples that he's given. He says, look at the people who in the past have been preserved, like the prophets and Job, as examples of people who have gone through such profound suffering, yet they came out on the other end. And we look at things like, Job's example, where we can know that something, is just anguishing and misery, and he can go through that suffering and see God's compassion and God's mercy. So I love what James does is he doesn't just make this statement and then go on. He gives us examples of people who have done it, and a lot of times that is exactly what we need. It is so helpful to us to go through pain and suffering when we know that someone else has done it and done it successfully and understand what the result of that is. And so he says to be patient in suffering, to suffer long in these cases. Not only will it yield a reward for you, but look at the people who it has yielded a reward to. So think about that. Think about, and again, granted, we're not in the same shoes as the Christians. We're not suffering yet like they have. They weren't, we're not, being abused or persecuted for the beliefs that we have, for the stances that we have. It may come to that point one day, but as of now, we enjoy a lot of freedom that they didn't have. But he does remind us that while we may have experienced peace now, there may come a time when we do have to suffer. And he gives us a blueprint of how we need to do that, and where we need to look in times of suffering and in times where things aren't going in the ways that we feel like they need to go. So, as we conclude and as we look, let me first ask: is there any questions, comments, concerns, suggestions, and as always, complaints?
I was going to say I've been listening to a podcast where, and one of the things that the psychologist points out, it's on like on life skills or how to handle life or whatever, but it is the thing. What he kind of emphasizes is that you have whatever your burden is, you should bear it with honor. And for the example of if there's a death in the family. And if you're a wreck or either a spouse or a parent, and it's unexpected, and it's tragic, and you could just end up, crying and just but his point is, if you're just shriveling up tears and you can't get a grip on yourself, then you're not able to help anyone else. So what you should strive to be is bear your burden with honor. And that way you are also still able to be a help to others. And so maybe that's a little bit about what James is saying. Like, you know, we're going to have suffering, and it's you know, it's just our lot in life. There are things that are going to happen. And so how are you going to handle that? And I think what he's ultimately saying is, you know, you can choose two ways. You can sit there and you can mumble and grumble and poor pitiful me, or you can bear your burden with honor and, you know, plow through and, you know, try, you know, just keep trudging along and look for, you know, positivity and find ways to, you know, to find the silver lining in it. And that's you know, it's a better way of living. And that's, I think, what he is saying, because if you don't, then you know, you're going to be tossed, you're going to be your suffering is going to be long and painful. You will not, I mean, if you were firmly, like you said, established or grounded, then, you know, it's easier to not get pushed off of center. And then you don't, if that is his biggest weapon, then you're not easily moved by it. You're not, you know, it's not going to knock you down as hard.
That's great. That's a fantastic point. Thanks for sharing that. You know, it's, you know, as I think of what you just said, Wendy, suffering is an opportunity for us to show something about God. I think a lot of people look at suffering as a very selfish thing. Woe is me. Look at, you know, look at the terrible things that are happening to me. When you look at like Job and you look at the prophets, you look at what more it said, not just about themselves, but what more it said about God, that in their patience and in their suffering, that God was there and that God rewarded them for that. And so I think, you know, like you said, Wendy, we've got two ways that we can look at it. We can say, well, poor pitiful me. And all that does is just brings everything on us. Or we could point that towards God. And I think you see like the purposes of God in the suffering and in this story. So thanks for that's really very profound. Thanks, Wendy.
It's Jordan Peterson, not Wendy, but it's good. I mean, it is. His other point, one of his other points is you're wasting so much of your energy that you could on the mumbling and grumbling, and you should be saving that up for, you know, it should last you longer. And you should not, if you're expending all that effort and energy in the mumbling and grumbling, you're going to need that later, and you won't have it there because you're so mentally and probably physically exhausted and everything. Then, and then sadly, you're not a help to others, and you're going to be needing help. And so it's like a double whammy. So anyway, but
double whammy.
Double whammy.
I saw that show last week. Why does God allow suffering? If there was no evil or suffering in the world, why would we want to leave?
True.
I certainly want to go to heaven because I want to get out of this body one day. We'll lose our hearing, we'll lose our hair, we'll lose our eyes, we'll lose our mind, we'll lose our strength of body. As you get older, you don't know anything about that yet, Daniel, but that happens as you get older, and there's a reason for it.
And he's lost it all.
And I've lost it all. God still have my hair. God's calling us home. And we want to be ready to go, and we definitely are ready to go because we want to leave this old earth behind someday.
Amen.
Daniel, when I think of the patience, and of course he talks about Job here, when I think of patience and endurance, I think of parents who have a child with severe disabilities, because that's going to be a lifelong issue to have endurance on. And it's not only a matter of thinking about it's unfair to the parents, but then when the parents think it's not fair to the child. And that's real tough because you have to work through that and still have to know that for some reason God has a purpose in that. And it's not easy.
Great point.
Hey, Daniel,
Yes, sir.
just one example, biblical example. We can't ever really understand or fathom the thinking of God. We don't know his nature and understand it completely. That's not possible. We can try to define it and understand it, but there's much we can't understand. And I think about Joseph and all the bad luck that he had. You know, he's left for dead by his brothers and sold into slavery eventually, and then through a series of events, Joseph, you know, becomes second in command of all Egypt. And what I like to call the 55-20 rule, that would be Exodus 55 or Genesis 55-20. When Joseph appears, when his brothers appear before Joseph, rather, the passage says, "As for you, you meant evil against me." This is the emphasis, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, so they are today. Hard as it is for us to fathom, hard as it is for us to understand, much of what goes on in life, God intends for it to happen, and we should always strive the best that we can to see how it is that God means it for good.
Good point.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a fantastic reminder.
It's been said multiple times, things that go through fire, they're strengthened. That makes the metal, it makes it stronger. So
Absolutely. Well, as as the slide says right here, continue to read through. Encourage you to continue to read through this verse. Look out, or these verses, 5 verses this week, as we're continue to look through those and see if there's anything that stands out to you, or as you read the Bible. One of the things that that will happen is you find new things every time that you read it. Oftentimes, as you're praying this week, pray for the purposes of God to be accomplished through your patience, and think about your reaction to the return of Jesus. Consider that. How does that make you feel? And what are you doing to make preparations for that? So I really appreciate everyone's comments this evening. Very, very good discussion. Great observations of the text. I really appreciate everyone's feedback on that. Next week, we'll be concluding our study in the book of James, as we're going to be reading the last few verses in the book of James. We'll be reading 13 through 20. And so James will kind of pick up where he left off here next week. And so we'll conclude that next week. We're looking forward to that. If there's nothing else, Brother Danny, would you mind dismissing us in prayer?
Sure. Our gracious and kind and dear loving Father, thank you so much for the blessings of another day of life. Thankful, Father, for the gift of your Son and our Savior, Christ Jesus, and his willingness and his love to die on the cross, such a cruel death, so that we might have the promise of everlasting life if we're obedient to his will. Thank you for the mercy that you give us each day, the forgiveness that you offer us as we ask for it and as we're penitent. We know that we sin and fall short of your glory, and we beg your forgiveness. Thank you for the good class we've enjoyed tonight. Bless Daniel and his wife and their new baby, and we pray that you'll bless each of us so we might always be an encouragement to one another and not grumble, complain about the difficulties we might face in life. Thankful for our family and loved ones. Bless all who are traveling this week and keep them safe. Give us patience with one another. And we pray that you would help us to live in such a way that one day we can be together in that upper and better kingdom. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.